Speaking about Ukraine, let us start not with the last, but the first act of the play. In order to realize what's going on in Ukraine and how it's going to finish, one has to know the essence. At least 3 nations live in Ukraine today. They inhabit the 3 regions of the country: Novorossiya, New Russia, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kharkov, Odessa, Kherson, and Nikolaev, Little Russia or Little Rus, Kiev and Central Ukraine, and Galicia, Volyn, and Lvov. Besides, there are some smaller nations such as Romanians who live in Odessa region, Hungarians who live in Zakarpatsk, and Ruthenians who make a part of the population of Zakarpatsk. In other words, there are 3 main regions: Novorossiya, Little Russia, and Galicia. These are their historically developed names. In order to understand their differences, we can make a parallel with Lithuanian nations, although it cannot be very precise. Klaipėda and its inhabitants are mammal landers of Lithuanians who live in Klaipėda region. This is analogous to Galicia. The Samogitians will be represented as Ukrainians from Little Russia, and Lithuanians will be the Russians in Novorossiya. To make this parallel precise, these regions should be a part of our immense Lithuania. And now Ukrainians of Little Russia and Novorossiya residents, some of whom claim to be Russians, are clarifying their relationship. It would be the same if Samogitians tried to impose their Samogitian idea to the whole Lithuania. Then we would start clarifying where Samogitia begins and where it ends. Would we puzzle it out? No way. Analogous situation is with the Russians and Ukrainians of Little Russia and Novorossiya. Followers of the idea are trying to make the whole Ukraine Ukrainian. However, all the others are rejecting this idea. It would be the same if Samogitians tried to turn Lithuania into Samogitia. Some people would be in favor, and others against it. But there's one more essential aspect here: Galicia, or Klaipėda region as we represented it, and its mammal landers. Lithuanians of Klaipėda region have a different religion. They are Lutherans, and they have never lived with the rest of Lithuanians in the same region. While living among Germans, they were always considered to be second-class people since Germans controlled everything. We had our state. Samogitian history is very abundant, but Lithuanians in Klaipėda region used to live in an alien territory. They used to have a different culture and different mentality since they lived among Germans. Adolf Hitler, who adored moments of triumph, came by the cruiser called Deutschland, then changed it to a small torpedo boat, and at 2 p.m. disembarked at Klaipėda harbor. We have a similar situation in Galicia today. Catholics live in Lvov. Other regions are Orthodox. Besides, Galician Ukrainians have always been oppressed by the Poles and Austrians. They've always been treated as a second-class people despite the fact that they live on their own land. The Ukrainian language is prohibited, schools are closed, Lvov University is made Polish, even the name Western Ukraine is forbidden. And again, we observe different mentality, customs, and language. Modern Ukrainian as well as synthetic Esperanto has a father. There was a man who created it following the principle, let it not sound nice, but at least it won't be Russian. This person was Mikhail Sergeyevich Khrushchevsky. The language of Kievan Ukrainians is called Surzhyk. Russians understand it. They say pozdna, which means late, and the Ukrainians pronounce it as pizna. Russians say podrazdyel, which means subunit, and Ukrainians say pidrazdyel. I'm asking him, how do you say kot, a cat, in Ukrainian? to which he responds, "Kit," and it means a whale in Russian. And what's the word for whale in Ukrainian? He got offended and doesn't talk to me anymore. Mikhail Bulgakov, the White Guard. Now imagine that this funny sounding to Russian's language is imposed on the whole country. It would be the same if Samogitian was made the main official language in Lithuania. And the Ukrainian language in Lvov differs from Surzhyk. It has many more words of Polish, German, and Hungarian origin, since they lived in Austro-Hungary and among the Poles. In Soviet Union, these three formations were controlled by the Bolsheviks. The idea of a Soviet person was of great importance, thus all these controversies were concealed. Moreover, the Ukrainians of Little Russia and Novorossiya used to communicate with each other in Surzhyk. Although, when this motley Ukraine gained independence, the problem of ideology aroused. The second Ukrainian president Kuchma wrote a book, "Ukraine is not Russia." He did it for a reason. When I heard that you wrote the book, "Ukraine is not Russia," it seemed to be very ironic to me. What's the difference between these people and... and the people of the Russian region of Bryansk? Yes. There's no difference. You have to justify your point of view in order to have a different from Russian ideology. Otherwise, there will be questions like, why do we need Ukraine if it's identical to Russia? If Samogitia established their own state, it would have to be anti-Lithuanian. Otherwise, people would ask, why does one of the relatives live in Lithuania and another one in Samogitia if they both speak the same language? In other words, the ideology of the Galician part of Ukraine became the core ideology of the whole country. But Galician people have their own heroes. They have the right to have their own heroes like Stepan Bandera and Roman Shukhevych. When the state of Ukraine was created after October's revolution, Bandera and Shukhevych were fighting for their territory. The inhabitants of the part which was taken by Poland were oppressed by the Poles. They fought against Poles and killed them along with the Jews who also lived on these territories. They wanted to create a state that was independent from Poland. When in 1939 their territories were annexed to the USSR by Stalin, they were left without their own country again, and that made them fight against Bolsheviks. They waited for the Germans to come, expecting that they will grant them their independence. However, when the Germans came, Bandera was put in prison, and although he lived there in good conditions, his expectations of independence did not come true. After the Soviet victory in the World War II, Western Ukraine joined the USSR again, and the people on these lands started fighting against Moscow. They had the right to do that since they fought for the independence they imagined, but the methods they used for fighting were very cruel. The followers of Bandera are killing everybody who's related to the Soviets. We have to remember that certain part of these people worked for Hitler and were a part of the Hitlerism. They killed a lot of Ukrainians, but they also killed a lot of Poles. Assassinations of Poles during Hitler era was done by the Ukrainians who were part of the Nazi system. I recognize the right of Western Ukrainians to gain independence, which they never had. They've always been oppressed by someone: Austria, Poland, Moscow, and Berlin. But the problem arose when they made an effort to impose their ideology on Little Russia and Novorossiya, when the process of so-called Ukrainization of the country has started, based on the experience of Galicia. Independent Ukraine existed for only 17 days. On July 17th, Hitler announced Ukrainian government to be illegal. Bandera and Shuhevich were considered to be heroes since they fought against Moscow for the independence, but the inhabitants of Little Russia and Novorossiya were fighting against the followers of Bandera. Fathers and grandfathers of the inhabitants of Donetsk and Kiev were fighting against fathers and grandfathers of people in Galicia. During the past 20 years of Ukrainization, a new generation has grown up, who know nothing else but Ukraine as they see it today.
Išaugo karta žmonių, kurie jau nieko kito nežino, tik dabartinę va tokią Ukrainą.
It's a common case in Ukraine that parents and grandparents consider themselves to be Russians, whereas their children and grandchildren claim themselves to be Ukrainians in one family. A child comes back from school and accuses his grandfather to be an occupant. His father is a war veteran, but the child is taught differently at school. But from the point of view of Galicia, this is all right. All the Donetsk inhabitants are used to it already. First Maidan started in 2004 when the situation got simply crazy. They had the first in history third round of the election. Yushchenko won the election from the third attempt, and after 5 years his rating decreased to only 3%. Ukrainians who put up with Yushchenko's election didn't get anything in return. Yanukovych was elected afterwards, but again, everyone was dissatisfied. Whom do we have on the stage today? What kind of person is Poroshenko? What kind of people are Tymoshenko, Yatsenyuk, and Turchinov? They are the elite who governed Ukraine for the past 10-15 years. These are the same people who were standing on the stage of Maidan in 2004. During the period of 10 years, these were the exact same people who led Ukraine to the present situation. There are no new people among them. The Maidan event started last fall and people went out on the streets. The question is, what for? They went there because of the great dissatisfaction related neither to the language problem nor even to Galicia. Everyone was totally disappointed with the authorities. Different provocations appear on the background of this conflict, but it's not quite clear who initiates them. There's a geopolitical factor, but there are also local circumstances on the war between clans. For example, the governor of Dnipropetrovsk, the Jewish billionaire Kolomoisky, who lives in Switzerland, has control over Dnipropetrovsk. He has a conflict with Akhmetov, who lives in Donetsk. All of these billionaires have their own squads. All these factors are observed simultaneously. Three nations are in overall conflict, the conflict between generations. The new Ukrainian generation is growing in conditions when, to insinuate the new ideology, history of the country is being rewritten. By the way, during the tragic events in Odessa, everyone spoke Russian. The ones who set people on fire and those who tried to escape, yet there was a terrible aggression between them. Some people were for the united Ukraine and others were against this ideology. They demanded Russian language and independence. This is all happening in Ukraine. But above all that, there are also geopolitical interests. In the conditions of crisis and narrowing the dollar zone, the United States of America have their vital interests in preventing the unification of Russia and China and the success of their joint projects. Let us not forget that the United States is the only country in the world that used their nuclear weapons against Japan, which, by the way, was a non-nuclear country. Have we forgotten it? No, we can't forget it. We'll always react to all the threats that arise close to our borders. There's one more problem. Some people fear that Russian army is going to appear close to their homes. There are three countries in the way of the US: Russia, China, and Iran. The United States will do their best to weaken these countries, so that Washington could be an absolute hegemony. It is closely related to what is happening in Ukraine. It's already known that the Ukrainian putsch was supported by the US, by Washington, because it's less likely that the majority of the US population is aware of that. It was always financed by Washington. And today, Obama's administration turns a blind eye to many shady characters in the new Ukrainian government. Washington wants to place its military bases in Ukraine to threaten Russia and weaken the potential of its army. President Obama is fully controlled by Wall Street and the major European capital, mostly by the British one. Western European and US banks are desperately impoverished. The banks need new objects to rob, and if you see the agreement that the EU wanted Yanukovych to sign, but he refused to, you'll see that this document was about to open the doors for the West to rob Ukraine. But the main goal, of course, was to enter the Eurasian well-being. If this means a direct conflict, the people who control Obama are not going to stop. They need to maintain the soap bubble of the Western financial world flowing, and Obama is being guided by them. It contradicts the US interests, but is demanded by Wall Street and London. Eurasia includes such country as China. It's 1.4 billion people, and it's a strong country. India is 1.2 billion people, but Russia is not a weak player either. On one hand, we have all these countries united together, and on the other hand, it's the British Empire which pretends to be controlling the world, stealing oil from the US, destroying the agriculture. Yes, it does it all to us. The only way for Great Britain to survive is to rob, destroy, and conquer Eurasia. I'm not sure whether Russians need Donetsk and Lugansk, and whether they need the referendum where people express their will, but I suspect that Putin doesn't know what to do next. Our partners from America and Europe share a considerable part of guilt for the events in Ukraine. They supported coup d'etat and caused chaos in the country. And now they want us to take all the responsibility and to clean all their mess. Moreover, only the US is very interested in Russia's military invasion into Ukraine. Why? Because in the fight for its geopolitical concerns, it needs the sanctions against Russia to be imposed. But there's a problem. Europe started to resist it. The new Ukrainian government of Nazis and neo-fascists is going to oppress the Ukrainian people the way they were never oppressed in their whole history. And the EU supports it blindly, doesn't it? Yes, America seeks to push the boundaries of NATO as close to Russia as possible. This is unacceptable, irresponsible, and it's a real provocation. The president doesn't know or understand anything. The leaders of Svoboda Party have a close connection with the National Democratic Party of Germany, as well as the other nationalist parties in Europe. The leader of Svoboda Party, Oleg Tignibok, confirmed this by saying, "Take weapons and fight with Russian, German, and Jewish pigs." Right now, Jews and pro-Russian Ukrainians are being hunted, and you're being silent? Do we still talk to these people? This is unbelievable that the EU supported coup d'etat of the legitimate government of Ukraine, which led to the negative reaction of Russia. I'm a politician, and I consider the logic of the suicidal policy to be incomprehensible. Europe has started to realize that it's going to suffer itself much more than Russia because of these sanctions. At present time, Merkel has already lost control over her industrialists. After inviting Merkel, Obama criticized her for the fact that German society supports Putin more than himself. Current statistics shows that German society is in favor of Moscow and not only the German society. Today they need to give Europe a good reason for imposing these sanctions. If Russia invaded Ukraine, such a reason would appear. We're thinking that Russia is dreaming about taking over Donetsk, but I think it's vice versa. Russia is trying its best to resist this provocation. What is Putin's situation right now? The events have happened in Odessa. People were burned alive, and Putin said that he would defend the people in Novorossiya, especially since they call themselves Russians. Some people think that Russians were brought there, but most of them have lived on these territories for over 2,000 years, since the reign of Catherine the Great. Putin must help the others, since that's what Russians demand from him. When he took over the Crimea, his rating has skyrocketed, and now people want him to save the others. But Putin understands that in this case, Americans are going to demand sanctions. Europe would not have counter-arguments, and it would have to give in. In this case, both Russia and Europe would lose. Lugansk and Donetsk have declared their independence and want to be annexed to Russia. They have coal mines, and the prime cost for the coal is exceptionally high, and it's difficult to sell it. Besides, Russia has a lot of its own coal, and it doesn't need any more. But Russian people live there, and they have Russian mentality, culture, and language. So if you don't help, it would be wrong, but if you help, it's going to be worse. I think that the assistance will be coming in a roundabout way. In any case, Russia is going to resist invading Ukraine for as long as possible, because it's absolutely not interested in that. These regions don't have the same support as they had it in Crimea. We have to understand that the Crimea had a status of an autonomic republic while it was part of Ukraine. Donetsk and Lugansk don't have the same status. Their situation is quite different. The Crimea has seaports. The city of Sevastopol, the territory of the Crimea, is of strategical importance. Here's another interesting moment. Public Procurement Department of the US posted an article on its website a few months ago. They were looking for somebody who could renovate the school of Sevastopol. Marine infantry or somebody else was going to live there. In other words, they had no doubts that they were going to possess the Crimea and had been preparing for it beforehand. People on the southeast of Ukraine, as well as in the Crimea, were afraid of the current situation. They decided to hold a referendum on joining Russia. We gave them the opportunity to express their will. If we had not done that, it would have been worse in the Crimea than in Odessa, where people were being burnt alive. And who hasn't noticed the CEO of CIA and the Vice President of the US visiting Kiev? It is inhabited by the Americans, Germans, English, French, Poles, and Lithuanians. We're constantly there. Hug each other and be united. Create a Maidan all over Ukraine. And then they claim, no, we don't interfere. Americans need Ukraine to be in chaos, so that Russia would be provoked to invade it, and later they'll scream about it, forcing Europe to impose sanctions. Europe, on the contrary, is against the chaos. It understands very well where the chaos is going to lead. So does Russia. Tomorrow, Ukraine may find itself within NATO, and the day after tomorrow, American missile defense elements are going to be located there. Nobody else discusses such decisions with us. They tell us it's not against you and it's none of your business. We got tired of this form of negotiations. There's no negotiations. Kissinger says the same thing. He thinks that the situation naturally occurred in the Crimea, and Putin took advantage of it. Moreover, there's a proper population on the peninsula, and the Crimea is strategically necessary for Russia. Who insinuates all this chaos? Yatsenyuk, who is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Poroshenko, a former Minister of Trade, and Timoshenko, a former Prime Minister. They're all authorities. When Maidan started, Yanukovych ordered not to resist it. He was called a tyrant, although nobody died during the time when he was in power. But now people are crushing each other with tanks. 2 or 3 months ago, Yanukovych offered Yatsenyuk the post of Prime Minister and even agreed with the preliminary election. He agreed with everything. Why did he need this upheaval if he had a chance to become a prime minister without this chaos? The election would have started a few months earlier. Why was all of this necessary? Today Ukraine is being destroyed as a state. If they had not taken those actions on February 22nd, when Yanukovych was forced to flee, if their right sector, along with Muzychko and Yarosh, were controlled, a normal election would have taken place. There would not have been either the Crimean event or a referendum in Donetsk and Lugansk. If Russia needs Ukraine, it needs all of it, because with just one part of Ukraine, there's too much trouble. But NATO's parts of Ukraine are activated, and Russia is getting more and more of Ukrainian hostility. If one part of Ukraine is going to ask NATO for military help, what is Russia going to win? Russia doesn't want to take the whole Ukraine, and it won't be able to. So why did all these Yatsenyuks start all this chaos if they could come to power the easy and legal way? There's only one answer. The players in this game needed chaos. If Yatsenyuk had become a prime minister legally, it would not have been possible to blow up all this raging fire. The game players don't care about what's going to happen in Donetsk. They just need a conflict. They don't care about Ukraine or EU as many of people think. They adhere to their own political interests. And on the background of their interests are Ukraine, European Union, or Lithuania. They're just the source of the backstage noise.